the reason this session got scheduled is, like I've mentioned, I've been doing more work in Canada, and one of the things you find out is they do things different up in Canada. And one of the things, the phrases you hear a lot in Canada is, how does the industry maintain their social license? And you hear the public talking about social license, you hear the industry talking about social license, and you know there's this belief that the industry has to maintain certain standards if they want to operate in Canada, and it's kind of something we don't hear about as much in the U.S. And then as I've proceeded in work in Canada, you find out that they use third-party audits. They sometimes share those audits with the public. They have these external advisory panels. So they do a lot of more kind of that type of accountability, different than I see most companies here in the U.S. doing. So I thought it'd be an interesting session to do. And first up is Jim Donihee, who is the Chief Operating Officer for CEPA, who introduced me to some of these concepts. So we thought we'd let the Canadians, start off. And Jim likes to pace, so when he falls off the edge here, don't be surprised.
I have a lot of space.
Yep, podiums and I are anathema to one another. I don't know, I enjoy moving around a little bit. So thank you. Thank you to the hardcore, and now that the gloves are off, and I thank you for that, so we can dive right in. Really quick image, first of all, in terms of who is CEPA, just to, pardon me, give you a quick sense of that. I mean, and it's quite germane, in fact, to our ability to do some of the things I'm going to talk about very quickly. It may feel like a little bit of a drive-by shooting here in the next 15-ish minutes, because there's a lot of initiatives that are underway. And I just want to give you a sampler of some of the things that are underway, and then perhaps hopefully have time for questions afterwards and so on. But, 12 companies, we deal with both oil and gas in our membership. Soon to be 11 companies with the merger of Spectra and Enbridge that's under consideration at the moment. Large players, and I'll speak more about that as well. A few stats. I mean, I won't dwell on these, and I think the one perhaps that is really germane is over the last year, 2015 operating year at least, total spill was 16 barrels only across all of these members, and we often quoted a stat that was sort of 99.9995% reliable in terms of what moves from one side of the nation to the other, and it is a laudable stat, but ultimately Carl, and I thank him for it, is extremely sobering, as I'm sure many of you would be in the audience here today when you say, that other 0005 that got out can create some extremely ugly pictures, and then they're wholly unacceptable. And we're working really hard to make sure that does not happen, and we are focused on getting to zero. There's a lot of things, Carl talked about some of the elephants in the room and some of the things that we're all facing at the moment, and undoubtedly, I talk about our industry, having spent my first life in Canada's Air Force all over the world and defending my country in many ways. Joined the industry in 2000, and I've had the opportunity to work on the upstream side as well as spending a stint at the National Energy Board as their chief operating officer in the mid-2000s. So, I've got a pretty interesting perspective of the context of a lot of the issues that we're working in. And at times I say, we failed to anticipate the change that was unfolding within our societies, and as an industry, both upstream and midstream, extremely good technically and in the downhole sort of characteristics, but there was a broad assumption that, when this infrastructure was required in North America, in Canada especially, that we'd simply be able to go there. And I think we failed to anticipate many of these, social changes that we're experiencing, and ultimately which are causing a great deal of dynamics in play, and ultimately is what a lot of this particular discussion is about when we're talking about trust and the kinds of things that need to happen. And so, trust is it's a complex concept, tough to get our hands on, and so I kind of wrap it around performance. We have a duty to perform. Accountability is absolutely enhanced by transparency. And these will all play out as we go forward. And so, what have we been doing then is within our own association to try and work on trust, and how do we come to understand really what are the concerns of citizens across the land. This data is a little bit old, but I just like the way it's presented. Many of the issues haven't changed, and so in that box, I'm highlighting that really the concerns we've talked about. Can you operate safely? should a spill occur in that unlikely event that it ever does, first of all, what are you doing to prevent them? How good is your emergency response? And, the one that's most glaring at the bottom of the chart that you probably can't read if your eyesight is anything like mine, but ultimately it's, are you open and transparent about the things that we most need to learn about and hear about in terms of how that's all playing out? So I use this chart often because I want to put in context, who CEPA is and how we can perhaps serve as as a leader in many ways. And by virtue of the fact that there's only those 12 companies, soon to be 11 that I mentioned, that are all, relatively sophisticated, and by sophisticated, by no means infer perfect, that they're kind of at the top end of a continuum of sophistication. These are the superpowers of pipeline operations, if you will, that we do represent. And because there's only 12, they can position themselves to actually take and hold each other to account themselves in terms of a lot of the things that are at play, and I'll speak more to that. When we deal with trust, again, very, very technical industry. I'm not an engineer, and I make no apology about that. But often it's interesting to try and put an abstract concept into the form of an equation, so that we can what are the bits and pieces, and how do we begin to make sense of this, and how do we ensure that if this, like many other equations, are acceptable as a concept for us to work from. How are we attacking each one of the elements of that equation to make sure that they're going to get the outcome that we're chasing, that we can bring some definition of this concept of trust. And so clearly, are we credible? And this applies to any of us. I mean, to the regulators, and to everyone. Are we credible? Have we got the talent? Have we got the competence? Have we got the knowledge? The things like that we need? Are we reliable? Can you look me in the eye and know that my word is meaningful to you when we have a conversation, and that I'm going to be there over the long haul? And intimacy in terms of the relationship, again, so that it's not a drive-by shooting. I'm not just dropping a deck on your desk, never to be seen again. And clearly the denominator can kill that in a heartbeat if we're altogether too focused on self-interest at any time. So it's a nice framework from which to have many of these conversations in terms of going forward. There's a lot of initiatives under play, and I won't enumerate them here so that I can dwell on them as we touch upon them moving through. But the 12 members that are part of CEPA are absolutely focused on getting to zero and finding a way to do that. And so this sort of four-pillared approach in terms of how we're going at it is what brings focus to our efforts. And I'm going to speak primarily to the first two, but I'd be happy to take questions on the others in question period. The org chart, again, not to dwell upon it, but we're about 2.5, 3 years into a totally revamped organizational structure within the association, and I can say, hand on heart, that it absolutely has made a difference. And so when we take a look at the pieces then that have come into place, CEOs only at our board of directors table. There's only two exceptions to that, and that is TransCanada and Enbridge, just because of the large conglomerate nature of them. But ultimately, to sit at the table, you must have the ability to encumber your company on the kinds of decisions that are being taken. And so I can say that the quality of conversations has changed very markedly over the last 2.5 to 3 years by virtue of having the right players at that table. And they look each other in the eye when things are not going the way they should, and they're holding each other to account and want to understand where and how they can learn from each other in terms of, be it mishaps or be it best practices, and the kind of things that play out. And the other piece that I'll bring your attention to and speak in a little more detail about is that external advisory panel. And I do consider that we're blessed to have Carl as a member of that particular panel, along with many others. And I often euphemistically refer to it as the Buckley's panel. If you think about Buckley's corn syrup and the fact that often they'll say, it may not taste so great, but it's extremely good for you in terms of the attributes of the panel and the things that it does for you. And so, very quickly, why did we do it? And we heard some of the stories this morning in the discussions around public awareness. And I think, too often, CEOs and others, leaders of organizations, and sometimes the regulators too, they're not at the cold face. They don't have firsthand of experience of some of those photos that we saw, from that public awareness panel and some of the others. And so it's really important to be able to know that we can have experts, critical, credible experts that can join us at that table and have unfettered access to the CEOs of this industry in order to make sure that they're hearing the truth of the experience that we saw with some of those photos this morning and so on, so that these programs are real and that they have meat and that they're being prioritized in a proper way based on the kinds of folks that sit at that table. You'll see, of course, the individual on the right, the bottom right there. I think he's smiling actually because that's the only time we saw him without a bowl of poutine, during this one particular meeting. But, to give you an example, the kinds of likes of folks that are there, the lady is a regional leader of the Chamber of Commerce for the Atlantic Provinces of Canada. The gentleman standing is the chief of the Canadian Fire Chiefs Association, so that we're working very deliberately with first responders. And the other gentleman is a national critic who does a lot of polling and public opinion work in order to make sure that we're hearing, again, unfettered truths around what's going on the land. And again, a broad range of participation, First Nations and Aboriginal leaders, landowners, and so on and so forth. And so direct, unfettered access, real truths. And I think the other piece that's quite important to us is that they report independently in our annual report on many of the programs we have in action. So it's a nice way, again, to have a truly independent voice of what's playing out. Integrity first, and ultimately I won't talk to this other than to say we're doing a lot of work to get an industry improvement cycle in place at the industry level to make sure that we're looking at leading edge indicators to move forward, and what does that all mean. And ultimately it's led us to Integrity First, which is one of our keynote programs moving forward in that way. There's a number of priorities that are broken out. Again, I won't dwell on these other than to say the ones that you see highlighted are the ones that we've attacked first and foremost. And the thinking being not that we're not doing work, of course, in the environment or in the socioeconomic areas, but if we can keep it in the pipe, if we can get it right from that regard, clearly you're already doing a lot of work in order to protect the environment and move in that way. I highlight the one that you can't see, I guess, with the color that I chose, but what's really important to recognize is that it's based on management systems. It's intended to be very forthright in terms of a plan, do, check, act sort of process that I think many in the room would understand. And it's highly critical in terms of the way that it's developed and the way that it moves forward. The big piece, of course, is that this has been decided upon by those CEOs of our companies to be a condition of membership within CEPA. So unlike a lot of other associations where, if you show up with a check and at the door you can buy your membership, there are conditions of performance-related membership in terms of what's unfolding and the way that we're growing this program forward. And ultimately, much like responsible care for many of you, if you're familiar with that, it is checked. In fact, for damage prevention, which is one of the key programs, it is being externally validated, verified, as we speak, literally, which is the first of the practices, obviously so key to everyone. ERMCVS, which is a global firm that does environmental monitoring, which does verifications and audits across a number of fields, be it ISO, be it operating regulations and so on, was selected to act as an independent verifier of our work across this program, which will be reported upon in an independent fashion. So in much the same way that your financials would be audited by, you pick a firm, whether it's an E&Y or a PwC, the manner in which we perform within this program will be independently verified by this particular firm and others perhaps in the future as the program grows out and moves forward. We heard a little bit about metrics and the way that leads to performance and what a challenge that can be from time to time. And the operating context in Canada, as Peter Watson described this morning, presents a lot of challenges to us as well as a lot of invitations, because with different jurisdictions, I often refer to it as the many dialects of safety. The different regulators each have different definitions, we often use the same terminology with different definitions across some of those different jurisdictions, and it complicates the ability to be transparent. The one thing that I would say is that we welcome transparency and we welcome accountability. And in fact, CEPA has been, at the forefront of doing some work, and we again thank PSD for accepting, the challenge that we offered to them when we provided a grant of funding so that it could be executed in a wholly independent way. Was, can you provide us with that white paper of what would be some simple, highly meaningful metrics to citizens so that you can hold us to account? We're not too fussed about what they are. We just want to know that we can have common metrics across the land from all of these different jurisdictions so that you can benchmark us, you can hold us to account, you can compare company to company as well as across these different jurisdictions. So we're making headway on that front. That paper has been completed, and we've done a fair bit of work with the Western Regulatory Forum, which is the combination of the National Energy Board and the three major provincial regulators that look after this work. We would like to say honestly that it would be moving more quickly because again we're eager to have the spotlight shone on the industry in a common and accountable way. But ultimately it's making some headway. And for that reason, as Peter mentioned again, we've made overtures to the Canadian Standards Association, which is a national standard setting organization, in order to take this up and try and assist in moving it forward. Maps, a lot of us have maps, so we have a map too. But the piece that I think is interesting of it earlier, and I was taken with Craig's comments around Marathon's map, but this map at the association level on our website, which I commend to you, will identify, so who's the operator, what's the product in it, who's the regulator, and it also reports transparently on the incidents that this particular operator may have had in context so that you can understand what that is, but you can take a look at that then based on where you live and the kinds of things that have transpired to get a true view of the operators and where the pipelines reside in your neighborhood, so to speak. Work that we've done again then on the transparency side. 2 years ago we launched our first annual, followed up again in 2016 by an annual performance report. And I commend that to you as well and would openly and thankfully receive your feedback on it. It's intended to be extremely readable, very straight up, no pretense. In many ways it endeavors to hit on many of the comments that were made this morning too. It doesn't seek to be an advertising PR blitz. It does seek to be very understandable and readable and educational in nature in terms of openly saying, look, there's some things